following some breaking news in the Gilgo Beach serial murder case. And Rex Heuermann is now expected to plead guilty tomorrow in the death of an eighth woman.
Case that haunted Long Island for nearly 2 decades, and it could all come to an end next week. Suspected Gilgo Beach killer Rex Heuermann.
Investigators say they are pouring through new evidence now after the arrest of a man suspected of being a serial killer in New York.
What if a serial killer didn't hide in the shadows, but lived a completely normal life right in front of everyone? For over a decade, the Gilgo Beach case was a mystery that made no sense. Bodies kept appearing along the same quiet stretch of road, but the person responsible? Gone. No mistakes, no trace, just silence. Then suddenly, after years of nothing, a suspect is arrested. And almost overnight, the narrative shifts. Some say he finally confessed. But here's the problem. The deeper you look into this case, the more unsettling it becomes. Because the truth isn't clean, it's not simple. And it raises one chilling question. Was this really the end of the story, or just the beginning? The Gilgo Beach case didn't begin as a serial killer investigation. It started with a single disappearance that at the time didn't seem connected to anything larger. In May 2010, a 24-year-old woman named Shannon Gilbert vanished after a frantic 911 call in a gated community on Long Island. Her voice, reportedly panicked and disoriented, suggested something was very wrong. But before police could locate her, she was gone. Months later, in December 2010, authorities returned to the area to search for her. What they found instead would completely shift the direction of the investigation. A police officer and his K-9 unit were combing through a remote stretch along Ocean Parkway when they discovered human remains hidden in the brush. At first, it appeared to be an isolated case. But within days, more remains were uncovered, each one positioned in a similar manner, spaced out along the same desolate road. Eventually, 4 victims were identified: Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello. All 4 women had worked as escorts and had disappeared between 2007 and 2010. They had advertised their services online, arranged meetings with clients, and then vanished without a trace. The similarities between them were impossible to ignore. Each woman had been contacted in a similar way. Each had disappeared after meeting someone, and most disturbingly, their bodies had been deliberately concealed using burlap, suggesting planning, control, and a level of precision that pointed toward a single offender. As the search expanded in early 2011, investigators uncovered even more remains in the surrounding areas. In total, at least 11 victims were eventually linked to the Gilgo Beach area. Some of these cases dated back years earlier and did not perfectly match the pattern of the Gilgo 4, raising the possibility that there could have been more than one perpetrator, or that the killer's methods had evolved over time. Despite the scale and severity of the discoveries, the investigation quickly became complicated. There was no clear suspect, no direct eyewitness accounts, and very little forensic evidence that could immediately identify who was responsible. The location itself, isolated, difficult to access, and surrounded by dense vegetation, worked in the killer's favor, allowing bodies to remain hidden for extended periods. However, there were certain details that stood out. In the case of Melissa Barthelemy, investigators revealed that her phone had been used after her disappearance. A series of calls were made to her family, reportedly by a man who spoke calmly and briefly, withholding any identifying information. The calls were traced to areas in Manhattan, but they were made using burner phones, devices specifically chosen to avoid detection. This detail suggested a level of awareness that went beyond impulsive violence. Whoever was responsible understood how investigations worked. They knew how to minimize risk, and they were confident enough to maintain contact, even after the crime. For years, these fragments of evidence weren't enough to move the case forward. Leads came and went. Suspects were considered and dismissed. And over time, public attention began to fade. But internally, the case never truly closed. Behind the scenes, investigators continued to preserve evidence, document patterns, and revisit unanswered questions. And as technology advanced, particularly in areas like DNA analysis and digital tracking, those old pieces of evidence began to take on new significance. What once seemed like a dead end was slowly turning into something else, because buried within years of overlooked data was a connection that had been missed. And once it was finally noticed, it didn't just point to a suspect. It pointed to someone who had been hiding in plain sight all along. For years, the Gilgo Beach case sat in a strange place, never fully abandoned, but never moving forward either. That changed in 2022 when a new multi-agency task force was formed. Instead of chasing new leads, they went back, re-examining everything from the beginning with sharper tools and a more focused strategy. One of the most critical breaks came from something surprisingly simple: a witness description. Back in 2010, a witness connected to the disappearance of Amber Lynn Costello had described a client she was supposed to meet shortly before she vanished. The description included a physical profile and, more importantly, a vehicle, a dark-colored Chevrolet Avalanche. At the time, it wasn't enough to identify a suspect, but years later, with updated databases and cross-referencing tools, investigators were able to narrow it down. That vehicle led them to a man. Rex Heuermann was not what people expected. He was an architect based in Manhattan, running his own firm, living what appeared to be a structured professional life. No obvious criminal history. No immediate red flags that would place him at the center of one of the most disturbing cases in recent memory. But once his name entered the investigation, everything started to align. Authorities began analyzing phone records connected to burner phones used to contact victims. These devices had been carefully managed, activated, used briefly, and then discarded. But even with that level of caution, patterns remained. Cell tower data showed that the same general locations appeared repeatedly, areas tied to Heuermann's home and workplace. Then came the forensic evidence. Investigators recovered hair samples from the burlap used to wrap some of the victims. Through advanced DNA analysis, those hairs were linked not only to Heuermann, but also to members of his household. It was a crucial breakthrough, one that placed him in direct connection with the crime scenes. Piece by piece, the case was rebuilding itself. Surveillance teams tracked his movements. Digital records were reviewed. Financial activity, communication patterns, travel behavior, everything was examined. And what emerged was a timeline that, according to prosecutors, spanned years and aligned disturbingly well with the disappearances. In July 2023, Heuermann was arrested. He was initially charged in connection with multiple murders, including several of the Gilgo Four. Additional charges followed as investigators continued to analyze evidence. But here's where the narrative becomes more complicated. Despite headlines suggesting a confession, there has been no official, publicly confirmed admission of guilt in court. Heuermann has pleaded not guilty to the charges against him. The case is still active, and much of the evidence is being presented through legal proceedings rather than direct statements. Which means the full truth is still unfolding, and there are still unanswered questions. Were all 11 victims connected to the same person? Did the timeline extend further back than investigators currently believe? And perhaps most unsettling of all, how did someone allegedly responsible for crimes of this scale remain undetected for so long? What makes this case especially disturbing isn't just the violence. The Gilgo Beach killer finally confessed. The full dark story. What if a serial killer didn't hide in the shadows, but lived a completely normal life right in front of everyone? For over a decade, the Gilgo Beach case was a mystery that made no sense. Bodies kept appearing along the same quiet stretch of road, but the person responsible? Gone. No mistakes, no trace, just silence. Then suddenly, after years of nothing, a suspect is arrested. And almost overnight, the narrative shifts. Some say he finally confessed. But here's the problem. The deeper you look into this case, the more unsettling it becomes. Because the truth isn't